आओ लोगों के यही नूर खुदा पाओगे।
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome to our series, The Essence of Islam. If we see our society today, the general trend is that people are moving away from religion, especially the youth. And this is due to the fact that most people, they do not understand the true teachings their religions are trying to teach them. And the same is true for Islam. Many Muslims, especially the youth, they do not understand the true beautiful teachings of Islam. They do not understand the essence of those teachings, why we have been commanded to do certain things, why we have been told to not do certain things. We have been discussing various topics in this series as they have been presented by the Promised Messiah Islam. There's a 5-volume series, it's called The Essence of Islam, and the various extracts from the writings of the Promised Messiah Islam, they have been gathered together under certain topics. So whatever topic we like, we can pick that, and under that topic we'll be able to find relevant material. The topic we are going to discuss today is a very interesting topic, the 3 states of man. And in recent time, there's a lot of study that how we can make ourselves better, how we can improve our personality, and stuff like that. So today in the studio, I have with me Farhan Iqbal Sahib and Imtiaz Sahib. Welcome to the studio. Jazakallah for joining me.
Thank you.
Farhan Sahib, let's start with you. The Promised Messiah Islam, he discusses this topic at length, that we as humans, we have certain states, and either we can progress or we can remain at the very basic rudimentary level. So tell us what these states are, and what has the Promised Messiah Islam mentioned regarding these states.
Actually, this was a question that was asked at a religions conference about the moral and physical states of man. And the Promised Messiah, Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad alayhi salam, responded to it in his book, The Philosophy of the Teachings of Islam. And quotations from that book have been entered into Essence of Islam as well, where he talks about the 3 different states of man. And the very first one is called Nafs-e Ammara, which is mentioned in the Holy Qur'an. The Qur'an uses the words Nafs-e Ammara, and the Qur'an uses it in the context of a state of man where he's inclined towards evil. So it's a self that incites evil. And that is a state where we are basically starting, where our soul, or rather our self, is always trying to incline towards bad things, towards evil things. And that is the first state of a human being, where he doesn't have that moral compass to guide him towards the right state. He's just at that elementary stage where he has all this evil around him, or her, and he's attracted to it, and he wants to do those things which are wrong or which are bad for that person. So that's the first stage which the Promised Messiah talks about.
And it's interesting, you're mentioning that the first stage where Nafs-e Ammara, where the nafs or the self is sort of attracted to these evils. And in this day and age, Imtiaz, we're living in a society where we see so many evils, and it's readily available to us. The access is there for us. So before we speak about the Reformation the Promised Messiah Islam has discussed, he mentions that there are 3 stages.
Yes.
So Farhan Sahib, he just gave us the summary of the first stage. If you can kindly mention what the Promised Messiah Islam writes about the second stage.
Yes, the first state, which is a natural state of the self or of the nafs, Promised Messiah has also likened it to be animal, and not knowing where should be heading, or not knowing the purpose of man's creation. And once a man or a woman sort of advances and progresses to the next stage, that stage is the second state of man, and it is known as the Nafs-e Ammara. Lawama, actually, Nafs-e Lawama. And this state, which is also known as the moral state of man. The Holy Quran also talks about it. in Surah Al-Qiyamah, chapter 75, verse 3, where Allah the Exalted says, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, wa la uqsimu bin nafsil lawwama, that God Almighty call nafs lawwama, this nafs, to the witness, because it is a self that reproaches itself of misdeeds and bad actions. And so when man progresses from first stage, it basically goes to the second stage. And the promised Messiah alayhi salam has mentioned that this, why Allah the Exalted has called nafs lawwama to witness. It is to give this nafs a respect, to dignify it, because it has achieved something from moving from nafs amara to nafs lawwama. It's an achievement. And Allah the Exalted says that this is an achievement, that's why I'm calling you to witness. And when man does this, he becomes worthy of being in the presence of God Almighty. And the promised Messiah alayhi salam also gives a very interesting example that although this is the self that reproaches sin, but it does not have the complete power to do good. And he beautifully explains by giving an example of a weak or frail child. When he is learning how to walk, but sometimes he can't walk. Because he doesn't have power, he fumbles, he stumbles, he falls down, and he also sometimes is ashamed of falling down. So Promised Messiah alayhi salam says that so is the case with nafs lawwama, because this is the soul that wants to do good, and it's a moral stage of man, but sometimes due to his weakness, it stumbles. And when it stumbles, it makes mistake, but at the same time, he reproaches sin. So this stage is known as the moral stage of man, and it basically, in this stage, in nafs progresses from the stage of calling himself an animal to a human, where he loves to do good things, but sometimes falls short because of his
weakness.
weakness.
It's basically like a struggle. He's
exactly
having to do good, but at the same time he's struggling.
That is correct.
Yeah. So, and the promised Messiah ﷺ, he mentions that most of us, we find ourselves in this stage for Han Sahib, that we're struggling. We want to do good. And the promised Messiah ﷺ, he highlights this, that whenever you do something bad, you have that voice at the back of your head that don't do this. It's wrong. So it is that nafs lawwama telling you, calling witness that this is wrong, and all of us have that voice in the back of our heads. But when we progress from this, we started with Farhan Sahib, you were mentioning the first stage, which is Amara, then we went to the second stage, Nafs al-Lawwama, and then the promised Messiah ﷺ, he mentions the third stage.
Right.
So if you can highlight what the promised Messiah ﷺ has mentioned.
So what happens is that as Imtiaz Sahib was talking about the Nafs al-Lawwama, it's a stage where there's a state of war, right, between the good and evil, and sometimes you're doing good things and sometimes you have some weakness and you do something bad. And so this is not a perfect stage. This is not a stage where you can say that your relationship with God is now perfect and it's solid. No, because there are some times when you have when you end up doing something which is wrong and which is disobedience to God and those kind of things. So you are doing that, but constantly, if you struggle, and with the grace of Allah, with the blessings of Allah, you can then reach a stage where you win this battle, where you have won the war, and the goodness in you has won, and the evil side has completely been defeated. And that is a stage which is called nafs mutma'inna, when a person is completely at peace. And this is a perfect state where that all that evil that was within the human being is eradicated, and he has reached that stage where he is good, he is moral, he has reached that third stage where even the prophets and the saints and those people who are very close to God, the chosen ones, they reached this stage where they were completely at peace with themselves, with God, and the acts of goodness are are done almost naturally. There is no struggle anymore. They enjoy acts of goodness and anything good that is done, anything moral that is done. And this is also mentioned in the Holy Qur'an as well, that they reach that stage where God is pleased with them, they're pleased with God.
Exactly.
That is the stage, yes.
Yeah, and this is beautifully explained by the promised Messiah, ﷺ. And all of us, we can, sort of do like a self-reflection, self-analysis, and see where we are, because this kind of gives us a criteria, a guideline to see where we are. And as a result of that, after that self-reflection, we can see that, okay, now I want to progress, I want to move on from there. And the important point is, as you mentioned that, and as Imtiaz mentioned, that in the second stage, that battle is there, and sometimes there is a lapse. Sometimes we make a mistake, but we need to understand that if that mistake happens, it is okay, because it's part of the battle. We must continue, just like that child, the example Imtiaz mentioned. We need to get up again, we need to shake our clothes, and we need to move on and continue with that.
Yeah, it's very methodical when you study this. When we were preparing for this as well, when we are reading these texts, it's so beautiful the way the promised Messiah alayhi salam talks about these stages, and it's very methodical, and it's a very satisfying understanding of these different states of human beings, and where do I stand? And we ask this question, and we are able to try understand what our stage is and where we have to get, and what our goal should be, right? Yes.
Yeah. So we were discussing the 3 stages of man, and all of these extracts, they have been taken from the book Philosophy of the Teachings of Islam, as it was mentioned in the beginning. So we'll continue on with this after a short break, that how the promised Messiah ﷺ tells us that how can we reform ourselves, keeping this in mind, that once we have done that self-analysis, self-reflection of where we stand, how can we make ourselves better. So please do join us after a short break.
Salat, prayer, and istighfar, seeking forgiveness, are excellent remedies for apathy and indifference. One should supplicate in salat, "O Allah, alienate me from my sins." If a person continues to pray sincerely, it is certain that his prayer would be answered sometime. It is not good to be in a hurry. A farmer does not harvest the crop immediately after sowing. One who is impatient is unfortunate. The sign of a pious one is that he is not impatient. Lack of patience has resulted in many a known case of failure. If a person digs a well to the depth of 20 arms length and stops short of just one due to his impatience, he would waste his entire labor. Were he to dig the remaining arm length with patience, he would achieve his purpose. It is the way of God Almighty that He bestows the blessings of love, eagerness, and understanding after sufferings.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome back. We were discussing the topic of 3 states of man, and the promised Messiah ﷺ, he has discussed this topic extensively in his book, The Philosophy of the Teachings of Islam. And all the quotations regarding this particular topic in essence of Islam have been taken from that book. So Franzab, if you can highlight this book when it was written, the significance of this book, because this book on its own, it has a very high importance in the Jamaat, and is considered one of the very important books that the promised Messiah ﷺ penned.
Yeah, this book was actually written in the context of religion's conference, basically. One person had this idea in the late 1890s to hold a conference where he invites people of different faiths to talk about certain questions. He had these 5 questions written down. One of the questions was about the physical and moral states of man, and he wanted all these different religious leaders to come and talk about it. And he invited the promised Messiah, Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad alayhi salam, as well, to come and talk on these topics. And the promised Messiah alayhi salam, at that time, this was actually a lecture for that occasion that he wrote, and it became a book, The Philosophy of the Teachings of Islam. And even before its publication, God revealed to him, Mazmoon Bala Raha, that this Mazmoon, this subject, this thesis that he's writing or this lecture that he's writing will prevail over all other lectures and that would be presented at this conference. And history bears testimony to the fact that when it was presented, actually it was presented by Hazrat Maulvi Abdul Karim Sahib Sialkoti, Raziyallahu anhu, at that occasion, and everybody loved it, and he did not finish it in time, and they extended the conference for another day so that he could finish the topic, the whole lecture that the Promised Messiah had prepared. And everybody was very much moved by the subject that was. And one quality that this book has is that it has no criticism of any other religious faith. It focuses on the Islamic teachings and the beauties of the Islamic religion, and that's why it's called the philosophy of the teachings of Islam, where no other religion is discussed or compared, and it's just about Islam and what does Islam say on these topics.
So, Jazakallah Farhan Sahab, giving us the background about this book, The Philosophy of the Teachings of Islam. And as you were mentioning, this book is very well written, it was very well received, and as you just mentioned, the conference, it had to be extended. So, sometimes people, they shy away from reading a book because they think, oh, if it's a big book or this and that. But from this, we can understand that this entire book, from the beginning until the end, when it was being read out, the people were so moved and they were so mesmerized that they wanted to listen. And as a result of that, the conference had to be extended.
Ahmad, an interesting fact about this, the promised Messiah, Imam Mahdi alayhi salam, especially talks about this book, says Allah the Almighty granted succor, help, to write this book. And that's why when you read this book, it resonates with common man. And these principles are so universal that immediately it resonates with you and starts sinking in. As you were mentioning, that when you read these states, of man or soul, you start to, analyzing yourself immediately, whether I fall into this stage or this stage. So immediately, like I said, this book, Promised Messiah Imam Mahdi alayhi salam, has written with the help of God Almighty, and that's why he was revealed by God Almighty that this essay will be mazmoon bala raha, that the Promised Messiah, this was the revelation.
Yeah, it will be better and it will be outstanding than all the other lectures that will be presented in that conference. And as Farhan Sahib mentioned that, the history bears fact that it was better than all other essays written presented during that conference. Now, Imtiaz Sahib, in this book, The Promised Messiah Islam, he's also drawn our attention towards this physical stages and the spiritual stages, and Hazur makes a comparison. So if you can shed some light on that the yes. Physical states and the spiritual states of man.
Yes, another interesting aspect of the philosophy of the teachings of Islam, whatever Promised Messiah salam is saying, he relates back to the Holy Qur'an. And he says the Holy Qur'an, about this particular question that you asked me, that the Holy Qur'an supports the fact that the physical stages of man has a strong relation with the moral and spiritual stages of man, or states of man. And he says that if these physical states are exercised according to the divine commandments and divine law, then our physical states, they turn into our moral states, and it has a huge impact on our spirituality. And Promised Messiah gives an example of a salt mine. He said, whatever you put in salt mine, it turns into a salt. So same thing, whatever commandments, whatever spiritual, physical stages we are in, if we align those physical stages to the divine commandments, they turn into our moral stages, and then what happens is it has a huge impact on our spirituality. The Promised Messiah has given several examples to show that how these two physical states and the moral and spiritual states, they are linked together. For example, he gives an example, when we cry sometime, even if it's out of, it's artificial, but it has a huge impact on our heart.
And I think Hazur also, for example, in one place he mentions that when we're reading books, sometimes we're reading novels and we know it's fiction.
Yes.
But you get so involved in reading that when you're reading that story, if something sad is mentioned, you start crying. And if something funny is mentioned, you start laughing. So exactly as you're mentioning,
Yes.
the promised Messiah ﷺ, in that day and age, he realized this, and he, from the Holy Quran, he spoke about this, that our physical body is very much linked to our spiritual body.
Exactly, and prostration. He gives the example of prostration. When you prostrate, it is observed that it generates humility. A person who walks with his head high and chest pushed out also generates arrogance. Then Prophet ﷺ says this is the reason why Allah the Exalted has put a lot of emphasis on our physical actions and physical things when it comes to attaining righteousness. For example, in case of worship, or all worship, all kinds of worship, cleanliness is very important. Other things are related to it. Those are physical. So those things are extremely important as they help us to pure ourselves internally, and then in return we get closer to God Almighty. So it has a very strong relationship with our spirit.
Yeah, and it's interesting to note that in recent times, a lot of research is being done on this topic, in the sense that, for example, one comment saying, people say that, if you want a certain job, you have to dress for that job. So meaning that, okay, you have to look the part, and that will translate into, it will give you confidence that when you go for the interview, you'll be able to do that. And similarly, if you have all the capabilities and qualifications, but sometimes because you're not confident, because you're not portraying that confidence, you don't end up getting that job. So this is the same thing the promised Messiah ﷺ is talking about, that in relation to worship, that sometimes if you're unable to enjoy salat, worship, then the promised Messiah ﷺ, he says that, okay, just try crying for fake, and eventually you'll get to that point where you actually start enjoying it. Right? So it's very interesting. I mean, the entire book and has been translated into so many languages by our community, and so many people, so many scholarly people, when they read this book, they admire it, and they're full of praise of this book. Now, for Hansa, we have discussed the three stages. We have discussed how the promised Messiah ﷺ has linked the spiritual and the physical aspect of it. Now we come to the Reformation. That I have made that analysis, I find where I stand, and now I want to reform myself. How do I do that?
Right. Actually, it's the same methodical approach that the promised Messiah has, where there are the three stages of man, where we can move from one stage to the next. There's also the three methods of reformation, right? So again, the three points come into play here. The first step, the promised Messiah says, is that a person is taught rudimentary morals, like wearing clothes, talking to others properly. The very basic moral qualities or moral teachings are given to human beings. And then the second step in the methods of reformation is that the higher moral values, the more delicate matters are taught to human beings. So these are the two stages, where the first stage is the very rudimentary things, and the next stage is the more detailed moral values that are taught.
So Imtiaz, if you can.
Yes, and the third stage of reformation that the promised Messiah, Imam Mahdi alayhi salam, talks about is that once you're accustomed to exercising good morals, and once you master the second stage, what happens is that person needs to be taught how to enjoy and relish the true love of God Almighty, and how to relish the true communion of God Almighty. It's like, getting yourself hooked on to this, and then once you're hooked onto it, then there is no way you're going to let it go.
Jazakallah Farhan Sahib, and Jazakallah Imtiaz Sahib for joining me for this discussion. We've been discussing this book, Essence of Islam. We've been discussing different topics, and due to the shortage of time, we can discuss small bits. But those who are interested, we encourage our viewers to pick up this book, whatever topic you're interested in. Today we were discussing the 3 states of man. If you want to read more, consult this book. And in this particular topic, I would highly recommend reading the entire book, The Philosophy of the Teachings of Islam. But apart from that, whatever topic you're interested in, pick up this book. There's 5-volume series. Open this book, and there are various topics discussed by the Promised Messiah ﷺ. So whatever your interest is, we encourage you to find that topic in this book and read the original words of the Promised Messiah ﷺ, which have been explained. He explains in his own words, and which all of his books, Zur highlights this point, that they have been written under the guidance of God Almighty. So Jazakallah once again for joining us today, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
आओ लोगों के ये नूर खुदा पाओगे, लो तुम्हें तौर तसल्ली का बताया